Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country, around the world, and especially inside Ukraine. We are going to continue to focus on Ukraine, despite the fact that many in the American media are not. It's never been more urgent. It's never been more important. And we've got a guest, a returning champion, to help us break it down. Our friend from inside Ukraine, the great and powerful Tim Mak, is back on Independent Americans. Welcome back, sir.
Thank you. I feel pretty hyped up from that introduction. So I'm ready. I'm ready to roll here.
You know, we got to get hyped up because I feel like I said this to somebody yesterday. You know, Ukraine's popularity in America seems to be falling faster than Joe Biden's, and we're going to have to bring some energy since he can't.
Just to fight the so-called Ukraine fatigue.
Yeah, right. I mean, I want to get into that. I want to get into how much you see it, where you are, but let's start with that. Tim, for folks who maybe didn't hear you back in May of 2023, the last time you were with us, where are you and how are you?
So I am in Kyiv. I am a journalist and the founder of the Counteroffensive, which your listeners and watchers can find at www.counteroffensive.news. So what we do is we dive deep into personal stories happening here in Ukraine and use that to illustrate what's happening in the news. Try to create an emotional connection to fight through some of this Ukraine fatigue by going and telling stories about people, who they are, and what they're going through. And so that's what we've been doing. It's been a long, I last appeared with you in May. It's been a long, I can't believe it's almost been a year. A lot of time to get physically exhausted. I feel a little physically exhausted. I think a lot of people do. I'm a lot better off than a lot of folks in Ukraine, though. So I don't have much to complain.
And you've been doing a great job of bringing those personal stories forward, and I think, frankly, that's what's kind of missing in a lot of American media. It feels like statistics or policy, but not really about the human stories of this conflict. And you've been bringing those forward. I want to dig into more of them, but you're also, you have that unique perspective of being, someone who served in uniform in the U.S. yourself, and that, informs your journalism. But can you give me a sense of something that's really tough, Tim? What is morale like in Kyiv right now? I mean, you're there, you've been there for a while, you can see the ups and downs. Is there Ukraine fatigue in Ukraine?
It's impossible to have Ukraine fatigue in Ukraine because every day the air alerts sound and every day there's new and terrible news. And whereas in the United States, Ukraine is a policy decision, here it's people's lives. And it's their father's life or their partner's life or their wife's life, their child's life. It's deeply personal and real. That said, that doesn't mean that people can't be exhausted and tired. And that doesn't mean that morale can't be down. And in fact, morale is probably as bad now as I've ever seen it. There's a sense of listlessness and confusion. There's a sense of even betrayal. I would say that a lot of Ukrainians looked at the United States as a staunch ally and friend, felt that they stood up and resisted at the encouragement of the United States. And now when they're vulnerable and things aren't exactly going their way, they feel like the rug's been pulled out from beneath them. And this is one of those times when a great American strategic victory is slowly turning into a possible American strategic defeat, in that Ukrainians feel deeply betrayed and by the folks who they felt like they could trust the most, and that's a really deep worry that I have over the medium term. But I think that in the medium to long term, if things don't go Ukraine's way, they might very well blame the United States for pulling support at a critical moment for them. And so, what do we see here in Ukraine? We see a lot of confusion, not a lot of public strategy for how Ukraine is going to prosecute the war going forward. And part of the reason for not having a public strategy is there's no certainty over what kind of help and assistance they can expect to get, either from Europe or from the United States. How can Zelensky or Syrskyi, the new commander-in-chief in Ukraine, how can they make a solid strategy about how the next year is going to go if they don't know what kind of tools they'll have to work.
Yep.
This is all happening in the context of what the Institute for the Study of War expects may be a renewed Russian offensive in the spring or summer. And so all these things are combining together with now more than 2 years of war, to really depress morale, to really act as a huge weight on everyone's shoulders. And I'm hearing that all the time from almost everyone that I speak to, that um, things are looking really bleak, and they expect it to get worse before it gets better, if it does get better.
I think that perspective is so important right now, Tim, and your perspective in examining it and seeing it change and ebb and flow. And you know, this is what Putin's been counting on all along, right? That American support would dwindle, that he could wear down the Ukrainians, he could wear down the West. And I was talking to a friend of the show, Adrian Bonenberger, last week, who said, you know, we lost in Vietnam, we lost in Iraq, we lost in Afghanistan, we can't lose in Ukraine, right? And I think that framing that up for America has been a struggle for those of us who understand it so clearly. And I know it's been a struggle for people in Ukraine. Can you talk, Tim, about what does it look like day to day in Kyiv? How do you see signs of the war? I mean, we're thinking about caskets coming home, you know, about the air raid drills. You're talking about the general mood, which as a reporter, you have, you know, a unique ability to feel. But how do you see the war on the streets and right now in Ukraine? And how do you see that looming cloud kind of manifest itself over you know, this critical Ukrainian city?
A few points. I mean, firstly, the air alerts and the bombardments are a regular feature of life in Kyiv, and even more so in points east of the capital city. And so that's a regular reminder to everyone. Secondly, you can't escape a conversation without some new depressing piece of information, whether it's some personal anecdote from someone close who someone you're meeting with just lost, or I mean, the Ukrainian government sees battlefield casualties as a sensitive piece of information, so it does not generally release the number of killed or wounded. Although Zelensky recently put the number at 31,000 killed, um, I would imagine that would be an undercount, given that that doesn't include, you know, missing in action that can be presumed to be dead. Um, and one of the things that does make it more real is if you go to a cemetery in say Western Ukraine, where a lot of soldiers are from, you'll see huge numbers of new plots, flags, flowers, memorials being built just over the last few months, and it's clear that people are losing their lives on a daily basis. If you go further east, you'll see makeshift memorials all over the place. You'll see mourning people. This is fresh and new and ongoing and devastating to so many folks. Um, while the United States has kind of lost a major part of the attention it has for Ukraine, like I said, you know, Ukraine, it's not a policy decision; it's real, and that's another element of it too, is the personal toll that's been taken. And the third and final point I'd make on this is the economic toll. Ukraine, as the war enters its third year, is having a lot of disputes with Poland, which is one of its staunchest military allies. But Polish farmers are blockading uh, Polish Ukrainian border checkpoints right now, preventing Ukrainian truckers from bringing goods into Europe. That this is just a pocketbook issue, but those farmers have decided that they no longer want to support Ukraine in an economic way. And I'm seeing all sorts of businesses that have managed to survive a couple of years starting now to shut down. They're not able to maintain commercial activity because folks don't want to spend money in an uncertain period of time. So all of that is really devastating to observe, and um, difficult to process, and they're the hallmarks of what is happening here in Ukraine right now.
Tim, that kind of insight is really, really important, I think, for folks to think about stores shuttering, disruptions to the economy. I want to ask you, to dig into the politics a little bit, because here in the U.S., it feels like, we have these blips when Zelensky visits someplace high profile or someone from the U.S. goes, right? So Schumer was recently there. Other members of Congress have come. When you're in Ukraine, from where you sit, do Ukrainians see that? Do they see Chuck Schumer? Does it register on the news? Are people talking about the American dignitaries and senior leaders that are showing up? And kind of a related question, what's Zelensky's popularity like? I know it's a difficult thing to put your finger on, but he replaced his senior military commander. That was a big move. I think we take for granted that he's going to live forever. I mean, we would have said it was a miracle if he survived the first couple of months, but every day, this guy could be taken out, especially after Navalny's passing. I think we could understand the magnitude of what would happen if Zelensky was killed or died. And that would, of course, be a priority for Putin. So are the American visits registering? And what's the popularity, favorability rating of Zelensky looking like now in your view?
Yeah, well, public surveys show that his popularity is dropping, but they're dropping from the astronomical heights of a wartime president, right? So, they're dropping from 90 down to, the 80s and even high 60s. These are approval ratings that, Joe Biden or Donald Trump or any other American politician would be very happy to have, let's say. But here's the thing, is that the war is dragging on. And I think that when you talk to folks, even folks who are supportive of Zelensky, they'll ask, what's the strategy? What's the path moving forward? And there's so much uncertainty about it. There are also supposed to be elections held this month, but the Ukrainian constitution prohibits an election during martial law during a war. And there's also big questions about how would soldiers vote, as well as how would we represent folks who are in occupied areas of Ukraine right now. And so right now, elections have been delayed, which have led to essentially Ukraine is not having this pressure valve to express their most immediate political opinions. If Zelensky were to hold an election, it would kind of be in his interest to, because he still remains extremely popular. There's no real alternative candidate that could likely unseat him, at least among regular political figures. There might be someone emerging from a military background or something like that, but it's a really uncertain time. And from the political perspective, I think Ukrainians see American and Western officials coming here, and I think, well, that's all well and good. But what about the folks who aren't coming? What about the folks who are voting affirmatively against Ukrainian interests in Europe and in the United States? How can we? They're thankful, of course, for Chuck Schumer's visit, but they're worried less about Chuck Schumer's visit. They're worried much more about how can we get Mike Johnson to let this vote on Ukraine aid come to the floor of the House. I think that's what matters.
Yep. And so we're going to build, throughout this grind of Johnson holding up the Ukraine funding. Then we've got a NATO meeting in Washington, right, in June, which will also be key. And then I got to imagine the biggest factor of all that everyone in Ukraine is watching is the American election, because there's no sense of what's going to happen if Trump wins. But suffice to say, they'd probably be betting on the bottom to drop out, right? It doesn't look like Johnson and Trump are going to totally turn this around. So as they plan to continue the fight against Putin, does everyone there at this point assume America is on the way out? I mean, it's a hard thing to put our finger on, but I think, have we lost the Ukrainian trust, right? It feels like hearkening back to the times of Afghanistan, where we left our allies hanging to die, literally. Is there a feeling now that America's gone and not coming back, or is there a feeling that Biden can be reelected, they can score some strategic wins on the battlefield, continue to get support from Europe and try to turn the tide? And especially also notwithstanding, I mean, the Navalny death has generated some level of pushback inside Russia, right? Some level of protest, Putin will likely squash it, but there's always a feeling that's a domino that could tip internally inside of Russia, right?
Well, I would say a couple things. I mean, I think that on the broader strategic sense, Ukraine, from the Ukrainians that I talk to, their one big strategic hope is that the war causes instability in Russia, leading to um, destabilization, leading to disintegration and a lack of an ability to continue to be a threat in the same way that it had been. Um, this is something that, if it does occur, will probably take a lot of folks by surprise, and it's
Hmm.
not something we can count on in an
Right.
imminent way. But in terms of imminence, I would say that that while Ukrainians have not given up on Americans yet, um, it is we're on the cusp. Um, I think that Ukrainians are deeply concerned about what will happen with the presidential elections. They're deeply concerned about why and how, given that the House and Senate both overwhelmingly support Ukraine aid, if you were to actually have a vote, um, why that hasn't been possible, why that hasn't moved forward. Um, and if there is some finality to it, and if they're told that it's really not coming and there's no hope of it, I think that's when you'll find a lot of that view that you suggested, which is giving up on the United States or feeling ultimately betrayed, and finally so. So that's I think a risk to America's strategic interests in the long term, not just in not just in Ukraine, but among all its allies that you hear in China. And I did some reporting from Taiwan as well. We've recently launched a monthly issue on Taiwan because we think it's so important to cover these places where authoritarianism is challenging democracy. In Taiwan, you're hearing all the time that in Chinese propaganda that you can't trust the United States. Just look at what they're doing in Ukraine.
Yep.
They're going to say they're going to back you, but when the chips are down, they're only going to back you for as long as they have the attention span to think about you. And once they forget about you, you're on your own. Just look at Ukraine. Um, so that's something that has really broad strategic implications, yeah, all across Europe, among NATO allies, and in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region as well.
Tim, I think, I'm glad to hear the counteroffensive is on Taiwan, because this is all interconnected. And I think we struggle to try to communicate that to folks who maybe aren't deeper into foreign policy or aren't global news watchers, trying to explain the interconnectivity and how it impacts American national security. But what do you think is the story that is not being told? You're on the ground, you got a good sense of the macro and the micro. One of the stories we've continued to come back to is the American veterans and Americans who have signed up to fight in different ways over there. I've always been surprised, frankly, it's not a bigger story, a bigger personal story. We don't know enough about these folks who've been serving and been killed. But what do you think is one of the most underreported stories that you wish folks pay closer attention to happening in Ukraine?
I agree with you entirely. I think that um, there hasn't been a lot of fundamentally investigative, deep reporting on American military veterans. I'm working on a story right now on one such case. I won't step on my own story too early, but we focus on telling these deeply reported future stories about people, and so um, that's what we'll be doing with this story. And we did a story recently about the interconnections between Taiwan and Ukraine. And we told that story through the mother of Jonathan Sen. And Jonathan is the only Taiwanese soldier to be killed in Ukraine, fighting for the Ukrainians. I went to Northeast Taiwan um, to meet with his family and try to understand who he was as a person, what motivated him to go all the way to Ukraine, a place where he didn't speak the language, didn't know the people, to fight to fight against the forces that he knew could one day threaten his own home islands in Taiwan as well. Um, I think you're right that this is all interconnected. You know, we have this philosophy at the counteroffensive that empathy and authoritarianism can't mix. That
Mm.
when we tell these stories about people, we tell you who they are. We dive deeply into their lives. And we tell you how dictatorships are trying to crush these lives. It's going to motivate and compel people to action. That's what we're hoping to do.
Tim, you mentioned in our conversations prior to this that you really had some incredible reporting around the Battle of Antonov Airfield, and I wanted to know, what you can share about that. Right, I wanted to give you a chance to share any insights into that or anything else that really you feel shows the personal side, but I obviously encourage everyone to check out all your work, but can you summarize that or something else that you think is really
Sure, sure.
incredible?
So we spent months working on what I think is the most important battle of the war in Ukraine so far. So we spent months tracking down folks who fought or were around this place called Antonov Airfield, which is northeast of Kyiv, about I'd say 45-minute drive. The drive quite a few times to do interviews and interview dozens of people over months. Because what we really wanted to do was explain what happened there. I mean, this was a battle which I argue after doing all this reporting is the reason why Kyiv didn't ultimately fall in the first 72 hours of the war. And I really wanted to give some human voice to it and explain how close Kyiv really was to falling. The Russian Special Operations Forces tried to land at this airfield, capturing the airfield and then bringing in thousands of Russian forces behind them, along with armored vehicles that were slated to land on cargo planes that were already in the sky. And the story that we did is a deeply reported story on how the Ukrainians managed to deny them that opportunity after the Russians landed. A really poorly equipped ragtag group of Ukrainian forces, National Guardsmen who weren't supposed to be in combat at all, combined with random Ukrainians who are just grabbing AKs, one magazine, trying to fight back however they can, and four sets of artillery that managed to make it within a striking distance just in time to knock out that airfield and prevent the cargo planes from landing. It's an epic story of, I think, the most important battle of this war so far, and we spent a lot of time fleshing out exactly how that all happened. I'd encourage anyone who's listening to check out that story right
Yeah,
now on the counteroffensive.
please. No, I mean, you described like the small arms fight, people running them over with cars, right? Like really, I mean, it's almost like,
Just gritty stuff, like just desperate
yeah,
stuff. Yeah.
it's Red Dawn stuff, right? I mean, it's like, we talk about it a lot, but like, if the Russians invaded, your town, how could you fight back? And it was resourceful and gritty and innovative I think that Snake Island got a lot of attention and other flashy
There's a
points.
bigger point, I think, which brings us to the news on it. This isn't just a
Yeah.
historical event. This is part of a war that continues to happen. The question, though, is will the West give the United States, or sorry, will the West give Ukraine the tools it needs to win? Ukrainians have shown through sweat and blood and tears that they have the will and they have the ability, when they're properly equipped, to fight back and push back against Russia. I heard very early in the invasion a quote about how, Ukraine, as long as there's a 12-year-old boy with a plastic spoon in Ukraine, there will be resistance against Russian occupation.
Mhm.
Now, you mentioned the stories of, folks who support Ukraine running over Russian soldiers with their car, doing anything that they can to push back against the invasion. They will fight. The Ukrainians will fight. The question is, will the West support them and give them the tools they need to effectively resist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the narrative of Ukraine has been miraculous in my view. I mean, the way they've told their story, especially in the early days, the gritty, innovative, heroic, David over Goliath type early days of the grandmas throwing soup cans at drones, right? And Snake Island and fuck you, Putin warship, all that stuff. In the early days, the building of the legend, right, was, I think, so important. And I think that legend lives on, but almost needs like a new reinvigoration. And you're telling those stories, you're communicating the human part. I love what you said, empathy and authoritarianism don't mix. And I think what we're struggling right now, those of us who feel a connection to Ukraine, is to create that empathy with our fellow Americans at a time when they seem distracted and are going to get further distracted, and they're being, fed misinformation. We know that misinformation and disinformation is a part of this effort from Putin and his allies. I want to finish, Tim, by asking you kind of a straight up question. As Tim Mak, right, as a person, I know you're an incredible reporter, you're doing all this work, but if you were sitting in a bar with some buddies back home that you were in the military with, and they were like, I don't really feel it. Ukraine's not our problem. We got shit to deal with back here. We've got all these migrants on the border. Trump says, don't worry about it. I mean, why should I give a shit about Ukraine? What would you tell them?
I would say it's not just about Ukraine. It's not just about this place thousands and thousands of miles away. It's about American credibility. It's about American national security all over the world. It's not just about this place that perhaps you've never been, this place called Ukraine. It's about the Asia Pacific. It's about the West Coast. It's about America's ability to exert its influence in everything from economic to investment to military to soft power to culture, all coming down to, can Americans be trusted at their word? This is implications for everything from diplomacy to the military and to business. Like I said earlier, China being a huge threat to the United States is something I think that person at the bar, my friend, who maybe I served with, might be concerned enough to understand, hey, look, this is not just about Russia. This is about Russia and China and Iran and the many other countries in the world who want to do the United States harm. This is about setting a precedent, and this is about sending a message to all of those other people, all those other states that want to kill Americans, want to cause harm to American national interests, and telling them, no, we're going to draw the line here to protect the democracy that's trying to protect itself.
Tim, as a follow-up, right? I'm going to be that ornery guy in the bar. You know what? I heard that. That sounds like what they said in Vietnam. It's what they said about Afghanistan. They said that about Iraq too. Like, we don't trust, Putin, but we also don't trust our own government. They told us this so many times before. Why should we believe Joe Biden and you now? Why is this different than all those other times when we heard it was another domino that was going to fall and America would be screwed?
I think it's all about an issue of motivation, right? In the cases that you mentioned, the United States was trying to come in and implement democracy and implement Western values and implement its view of the world. The United States doesn't need to convince anyone in Ukraine that they want to support democracy or that they want to protect their own territory. There are no talking points on this, right? The Ukrainians inherently want to defend themselves. What the United States is doing here is helping them do that. It's not coming in and implementing an agenda. It's not coming in and saying, you must turn your state from communist or authoritarian to democracy. It is a country that has created its own democracy through street protests, through demands on their own government, that is seeking to remain free. And that's what the United States is doing.
Tim, you're brilliant, and you're important, and your work is urgent and a tremendous public service. And I'm grateful for all the work you do and you continue to do. It's a grind. I know it's hard for you and your team, but you're doing some really, really important stuff that is cracking through. And especially as a guy who served in uniform yourself, I think you're showing folks how they can continue to serve at a higher level. And I'm really grateful that you took time to join us again and that you continue to do this work. You and I said it earlier, we got to have you on more often. We'd definitely like to do that in the months to come because it's absolutely going to be critical. Ukraine, in many ways, is more American than America right now. And that's a tough pill to swallow for some folks, but I think we got to push it on them. And your reporting, is the stories of American heroism that we wish we had right now. But it's happening in Ukraine, and you're there to witness it. Thank you for all you're doing, Tim, and for joining us on the show again.
Thanks so much, Paul. Thank you for the kind words.
You got it. Stay vigilant, my friend.